Hi there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of our three-part webinar series on carbon credits and carbon markets. We're all well aware, and evidence clearly shows that our planet has been getting hotter. Global average temperatures are now more than 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than what it was in the pre-industrial era. A degree doesn't sound like a lot, but the reality is very different and has shown that it has tremendous effect on climate, with erratic weather patterns, including heat waves, floods, storms, the loss of polar ice, and rising sea levels. And I'm sure all of us have heard of the last, floods in Dubai as well. This will only get worse if global warming intensifies. There are, of course, the naysayers, but we will leave that discussion for another time. With climate change and its impact, there is a growing sense of urgency to reduce what is called as greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs. Companies are integrating environmental, social, and governance factors into their business strategies. And investors are also increasingly required to consider these ESG factors in their investment decision. Addressing these challenges requires coordinated efforts involving technological innovation, policy support, financial incentives, and collaborative partnerships across sectors. Until such sectors transition to adoption of cleaner fuels with net zero emissions successfully, carbon credits may be one of the methods used to kind of reduce or offset their carbon footprint. We all know that India announced its very ambitious goals of achieving net zero by 2070 at COP26 in November 2021. Ambitious and surely so. But to achieve its stated decarbonization targets, India has already deployed a slew of energy policies across sectors. Let's take the power sector to start with, because it's one of the sectors which has a significant share in India's emissions. Promoting renewable energy has been a critical part of this strategy. Various policies, including guaranteed feed-in tariffs, accelerated depreciation of assets, green energy transmission corridors, solar parks, and ultra megacity electricity projects have all been part of the various policy initiatives in this sector. The implementation of renewable purchase obligations, RPOs, which is one of the topics that we will cover in this presentation and in this webinar, was an important policy initiative in this direction. Distributed RE is also a key element in the strategy. More recently, we've seen policies aimed at increasing the share of domestic manufacturing in the RE value chain through production-linked incentive schemes. Energy policies targeting the other energy-intensive industrial sectors include PAT, which is the Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, which is specifically aimed at improving the energy efficiency of industrial units. Another thing that we will cover in this webinar. In the transport sector, we all know of the FAME schemes, which is the faster adoption and manufacturing of hybrid and electric vehicles in India scheme, which incentivizes the adoption of electric vehicles. In January 2022, the government also initiated the green hydrogen mission to significantly increase hydrogen production and bring down production costs. In addition to all of these, there was an amendment to the Energy Conservation Act of 2021, which was passed in December 2022, paving the way to add another important policy instrument for emission reductions in the existing matrix, which was the Domestic Emissions Trading Scheme, ETS, called the Carbon Credit Trading Scheme. The unique feature of this is that for the first time, a policy instrument in India will directly target carbon dioxide emissions compared to other energy policies which targeted either energy efficiency or fuel switching. Now let's come to what net zero is, because that's what we have committed to as a nation committed to at COP. What is net zero, right? Net zero essentially refers to a balance between GHG emissions produced and GHG emissions which are taken out of the atmosphere. Net zero and carbon neutral are often referred to interchangeably, and both in some forms result in reduction or removal of CO2 from the environment, but they aren't necessarily the same. You've most likely heard the term carbon neutral being used when referring to businesses. In this case, it's often referring to the ambition of that particular industry or that particular company to limit any increase in future carbon emissions while using offsets to neutralize existing emissions. Net zero, on the other hand, places much more focus on reducing carbon emissions as much as possible first, and only offsetting unavoidable residual CO2 as a last resort. Carbon credits and the carbon market could be one of the ways to achieve net zero commitments and carbon neutrality as a whole for a large number of industries, and especially so in the hard to abate sectors, which is steel, cement, etc., where in the immediate term, it may not be easily possible to reduce carbon emissions. So what are carbon credits? In simple terms, a carbon credit refers to a tradable permit, which is generated either by one, emission reductions or removals through certified climate action projects that allow to offset the generation of GHG emissions somewhere else, or to the issuance of allowances from a regulatory body that provides the holder of the credit the right to emit 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent of another GHG. Though the term carbon credit is often used interchangeably to refer to both carbon credits and carbon offsets, there is a thin line of difference between the both. Carbon credits represent the right to emit a certain amount of GHG emissions, whereas carbon offsets represent the removal of a certain amount of GHG emissions from the atmosphere. How can carbon credits be used? So companies and organizations which have excess carbon credits can sell these to entities that need to offset their GHG emissions. Therefore, carbon credits create a monetary incentive for entities to reduce GHG emissions. A carbon credit market will also help to decarbonize the commercial and industrial sector by facilitating the trading of carbon credits. A regulated carbon market will also provide flexibility for the hard to abate industries which cannot immediately reduce their carbon emissions easily. But before we discuss carbon credits, types of carbon markets, carbon trading, and India's effort to set up a carbon market in detail, it's important to understand, it's also very important to understand the history and the legislative background and evolution of carbon credits, both internationally as well as domestically, right? Amoolya will also touch upon this in much more detail as we go along. But just to give you a very quick recap, the recognition of climate change, dates back all the way back to the late part of the 19th century. We've all heard of, I think we would be more familiar with the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, which set many benchmarks for global involvement in climate change initiatives. The lead up to the Kyoto Protocol started way back in 1979 with the first World Climate Conference making an early global effort to address climate-related issues and establish a platform for international cooperation on climate change. This was followed by the establishment of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 1988. Then in 1992, the UNFCCC text was adopted at the Earth Summit in Rio, which was an initiation of a framework for international climate negotiations along the adoption of the Rio Conventions. The first COP summit was held in 1995 in Berlin, which marked the annual gatherings for discussions and negotiations on climate progress and policies and agreements. 1997 was when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in COP3, establishing binding emission reduction targets for industrialized countries and introducing innovative mechanisms like emissions trading and the clean development mechanism to combat climate change. So we'll touch upon all of these things that I kind of mentioned. Like I mentioned earlier, it is a 3-part webinar series because we cannot cover everything in a single webinar. So the idea is, of course, today to kind of look at, can we just go to the next slide? I think I just give a context of, I don't know if the, yeah, so very quickly on the agenda, I've given you a very quick introduction to carbon credits. We will go into a little more detail about the historical context and Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And we will look at the Indian legislative framework on what we all are aware of, which is the RPOs, the RECs, the PAT scheme, the EScerts, and lastly, of course, the challenges and way forward. But before we start, let me quickly introduce the firm. I do this always because I know that a lot of people usually kind of join a little later. So it's always good to kind of keep our introductions for somewhere in between. And of course, the meatier parts are taken up by my colleagues because I just give the high level gyan. So very quick introduction to the firm. Spice Root Legal is a full service law firm. We have a very sector focused approach. And one of the sectors that we look at is what is called as energy and sustainability sector. In the energy and sustainability sector, we work across the value chain. We work with IPPs, we work with a lot of renewable energy companies, we work with OEMs. We've been closely involved with a lot of companies in the new energy initiatives by the government. We've been helping some of our clients in some of the various tenders which have come out, both on the hydrogen side as well as on storage and various other new energy initiatives which have been new energy initiatives and policies which have come out by the government. My name is Praveen Raju. I'm one of the founding partners of the firm. I lead the energy and sustainability team in Spice Root Legal, and I'm also the head of the corporate M&A and private equity practice in Spice Root Legal. I'll let my colleagues Amoolya and Janhavi give a quick introduction and take this forward.
Thank you, Praveen. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I am Janhavi, a renewable energy and sustainability lawyer and a senior associate at Spice Root Legal. We look forward to having some insightful discussions with you over the course of these 3 series of webinars.
Hi, everyone. I am Amoolya Khurana, and I'm a senior associate at Spice Root Legal. Welcome to the webinar, and I hope we have a great discussion on carbon credits today. Thank you, Praveen. So we'll begin with the Kyoto Protocol, and then we'll move on to the Paris Agreement. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was formally adopted in 1997 and entered into force in 2005. The import of the Kyoto Protocol was limited to developed and industrialized countries. Consider it like a penalty, since greenhouse gas emissions were considered to be a direct consequence of the massive industrialization undertaken by these countries. These countries were identified in Annex B to the protocol. They were identified as Annex B parties. They are 37 in number, and they were given binding emission reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol. Conversely, developing countries were exempted from the purview of targets altogether. Now, the Kyoto Protocol worked basically on 3 market-based mechanisms. The first of this is international emissions trading, which, as the name suggests, involves trading of emissions between countries. Essentially, each country was given a fixed quota of emissions they could emit, and consequently AAUs, or assigned amount units equivalent to the quota. Now, if a country managed to exceed its quota, it would have to buy AAUs from a country which had managed to reduce its emissions to an extent that it did not need all of the AAUs that had been given to it as part of its quota. The second market mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol was joint implementation, where Annex B countries could set up emission reduction projects in other Annex B countries where developmental costs may be lower. Now, the countries setting up the emission reduction project would then earn ERUs, or emission reduction units, which could then be counted towards its targets under the Kyoto Protocol. The third and arguably the most famous market mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol has been the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. Now, this is the one mechanism that bridged the gap between the Annex B countries and the others and allowed, essentially similar to the joint implementation mechanism, Annex B countries were permitted to set up certified emission reduction projects in non-Annex B countries where, again, developmental costs would be lower. And upon setting up these projects, those countries would earn CERs, or certified emission reduction credits. Now, each CER represents the equivalent of offsetting 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide and could be either utilized by the country or could be further sold. Now, we'll take an example here to explain the concept of clean development mechanism. For example, if a French company decided to fund a project in India involving rural electrification in a remote village using solar panels, then the CERs generated by the project would would be owned by France and could be used by it to meet its emission reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the CDM was very successful, and until about 2012, approximately 6,600 projects were registered under the mechanism, and CERs totaling around 1.2 billion tons of CO2 were issued. However, the CER market crashed in 2012. Now, the collapse of the market was on account of two reasons. One was the EU's isolationist carbon policy that prohibited the use of certified emission reductions in the EU area. And the second was Japan's retreat from its targets under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, these actions triggered a panic in CER buyers, a loss of confidence in the market, and essentially tanked the prices of CERs to 0.25 euros per tons of CO2, which at its highest was trading at 25 euros per ton of CO2. Now, I mentioned the offset mechanism while discussing CDM. So let me just quickly explain this concept since it's very important to understand the carbon market as a whole. Essentially, CERs and ERUs can only be generated and their numerical value can only be computed when compared with the level of emissions where it was business as usual and the CDM or the JI project with its objective of reducing emissions did not exist. Now, this is what we call the baseline scenario. We'll go back to our example of rural electrification. We'll add a few details to it and look at this again. Now, back to our example. We are looking at a project that intends to install solar-powered mini grids in a remote village in India. Now, these solar-powered mini grids will replace diesel generators, which we will assume have a baseline emission of, say, 50 tons of CO2 per year. Now, with the introduction of the mini grid, emissions from diesel generators will be eliminated. There will be zero emissions on account of electricity generation specific to that village, and consequently, 50 carbon credits will be generated. Therefore, each carbon offset project requires a baseline methodology as well as a monitoring methodology to measure the actual benefit on account of the project. Back to the Kyoto Protocol now. Now, it had an initial commitment period from 2008 to 2012, which was extended to 2020 with the Doha Amendment. During the first commitment period, out of the 36 countries which fully participated in the Kyoto Protocol, only 9 countries emitted higher levels of GHG than their targets, and these countries were also eventually able to meet their Annex B quotas. With respect to the second commitment period, new targets were set for participating countries. However, the Doha Amendment came into effect only in 2020, and most countries did not show much interest in participating in the second commitment period.
Amoolya, if I can just step in here for a brief minute, I would like to highlight that while Kyoto Protocol is, of course, a landmark international agreement, it has over the years carried with it some disapprovals. For example, it primarily targets emissions from developed countries, Annex 1 countries, like you mentioned. While I fully appreciate that this was due to the increased emissions caused by the industrially advanced countries, this sort of limited scope creates an unequal burden sharing mechanism and fails to address the rapidly growing emissions from major developing economies like China and India, right? The emission reduction targets set by the protocol have also been criticized as insufficient to prevent dangerous levels of global warming that we are witnessing these days. There is also a lack of strong enforcement. While countries are required to report their emissions, no doubt, and progress towards their targets, there are limited consequences for non-compliance, which really undermines the credibility and effectiveness of the agreement. Large greenhouse gas emitters like the US have in fact not ratified to the protocol, which indicates lack of participation. There are some other serious critical points raised by industry experts in relation to the environmental integrity of carbon offsets in terms of their usage and quality, which we will analyze in detail while discussing the carbon markets in the next session. Lastly, in terms of support, developing countries claim that there is insufficient provision of technology transfer and weak financial support to assist them in really mitigating and adapting to climate change. If you see Article 10C of Kyoto Protocol, it provides for all developing countries to take all practicable steps to facilitate and finance the transfer of or access to environmentally sound technologies, know-how, practices, and processes that are pertinent to climate change. But really, where is the financing gap being bridged, or where is the technological assistance being provided to these developing countries? These gaps have not been addressed under the Kyoto Protocol. If Amoolya can just fill us in on the Paris Agreement and its significance next.
Thank you, Janhavi. Okay, so picture this. We are in 2015. The CR market has already crashed. The second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol will expire in another 5 years and has been generally okay, but not without its problems, as we so rightly pointed out a short while ago. So in an effort to take care of some of the criticisms of the Kyoto Protocol, the Conference of Parties at the 21st Sustainable Development Summit in Paris signed the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement is applicable to almost all nations and requires all its signatories to put forward their best efforts through voluntary targets called NDCs, or Nationally Determined Contributions, which are required to be successively increasing and ambitious. All parties are also required to regularly report on their implementation efforts as well as their emissions. While this is a higher degree of accountability and enforcement as compared to the Kyoto Protocol, NDCs are not binding, and countries are being held accountable to achieve their NDCs through the establishment of an enhanced transparency framework. Now, the Paris Agreement also works on 3 approaches to reduce emissions. The first is the cooperative approach under Article 6.2, which is similar to international emissions trading under the Kyoto Protocol, and it essentially allows industries to enter into bilateral or multilateral arrangements through which one country can trade GHG emission reductions or removals with another country. Now, these reductions or removals being transferred are called ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, and can then be utilized towards meeting a country's NDC. The second approach is the carbon credit mechanism under Article 6.4, which is similar to the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol and aims to reduce emissions through registered offset projects. The credits generated through these projects are known as A6.4 ERs and can be utilized again towards a country's NDCs or transferred to another country as ITMOs under Article 6.2. The third approach is the non-market approach under Article 6.8. This one does not involve trading of emissions reductions or removals, but includes collaboration in finance, technology transfer, or capacity building. A great example of this would be a carbon tax. Now, the Paris Agreement also prevents double counting of emissions reductions through an accounting system known as corresponding adjustments. Essentially, it allows the country selling the emissions reductions to make an addition to its emission level, and the country acquiring the emission reduction to make a subtraction. So when the countries are preparing their baseline emissions balance for compliance under the Paris Agreement, any international transfers of emissions reductions are accounted for. Now, there are a few countries who have initiated pilot activities with an explicit reference to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, like Singapore, Switzerland, Canada, and Sweden. However, A6.4 ERs cannot be issued or traded until the supervisory body under the Paris Agreement formulates the rules for trading and a centralized registry like the CDM is put in place, which is likely to take some time. Until then, a process for transition of CDM projects to Article 6.4 mechanism has been put in place, which allows the CDM executive board to take certain decisions. Specific to India, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has put out a policy paper clarifying that existing CDM registered projects will be able to transition to the new Article 6.4 regime, provided that they have an active crediting period. It also clarifies that CERs from projects registered post-2013 can be used for meeting our country's NDCs. Back to the Paris Agreement now. Every 5 years, parties to the Paris Agreement are expected to evaluate their progress through a process referred to as the Global Stocktake. Up to September 2023, the parties to the Paris Agreement have agreed to establish the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27, which was operationalized on the first day of COP28. and looks to address the inequality of climate change by providing financial assistance to poorer countries who are not contributing towards greenhouse gas emissions and yet are most vulnerable to climate change and climate change disasters. Though this step is also not without its problems, because the trustee for the fund is the World Bank, which, as we all know, has a history of charging very high interest rates and whose shareholders include 6 of the world's major superpowers, indicating a very large bias. The second criticism has been that the amount pledged towards the fund is woefully insufficient. In addition to this, parties have also agreed to globally cut methane emissions. Moving on to the major criticisms of the Paris Agreement, and some of them will sound similar to the drawbacks of the Kyoto Protocol as well. The first criticism has been the voluntary commitments under the Paris Agreement. So unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which at least had binding emission reduction targets for developed countries, the Paris Agreement is heavily relying on voluntary commitments by way of NDCs. The second criticism has been the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement, where many analysts argue that the collective NDCs submit and definitely insufficient to meet the objectives of the PA, including the objective to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. There are also, like we said earlier, no clear guidelines on the carbon credit mechanism or on reporting and verification. Now, the third criticism of the Paris Agreement has been on the lack of the enforcement mechanism to ensure compliance with NDCs. Currently, there are no penalties and limited consequence for a country who fails to meet its NDC under the Paris Agreement. In addition, while the Paris Agreement focuses primarily on national governments, many of the key drivers of emissions, such as cities, businesses, and civil society organizations, are not directly represented in the agreement. This exclusion of non-state actors will limit the potential for broader and more inclusive climate change action. Now I'll ask Janhavi to take over from here and close out our discussion on the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Amoolya. So from what we hear so far, climate change action needs to be massively increased to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. But let's look at the brighter side. I think the years since its entry have already sparked low carbon solutions and new markets. More and more countries, regions, cities, and companies are establishing carbon neutrality targets. Zero carbon solutions are becoming competitive across economic sectors, specifically in the power. It is a party to both Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. In pursuance of the Kyoto Protocol, it has established the National CDM Authority, NCDMA, under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to provide a single window clearance for CDM projects in the country. Since ratifying the Paris Agreement, India has been at the forefront of climate action to meet the global goals through the ambitious NDC. India submitted its first NDC in the year 2015, which comprised of 2 quantifiable targets, and those were achieved well ahead of the time. Now, as per the updated NDC submitted to UNFCCC in August 2022, India stands committed to 1, reduce emissions intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030, and that's from the 2005 levels. And 2, to achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. For implementing its commitment under the Paris Agreement, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has notified the National Designated Authority for the implementation of the Paris Agreement to develop processes and frameworks under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement for International Carbon Trading, like Amoolya mentioned. Recently, NDA-IAPA has also finalized the list of activities that could be considered for trading of carbon credits. And some examples are solar thermal power, offshore wind, green hydrogen, compressed biogas, CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage activities. Surely all the anticipation and expectations from the growing low carbon market sounds exciting, more so for all the clean energy geeks in our team. And as a step towards India's commitment to playing a more proactive role in the fight against climate change, the Energy Conservation Act was amended, and Section 14W and Section 14AA were inserted to enable the central government to roll out a carbon credit trading scheme and to allow the central government or any other authorized agency to issue carbon credit certificate to a registered entity which complies with the requirements of such scheme. Accordingly, the carbon credit trading scheme was notified by the central government in consultation with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, BEE, in June of 2023. Now, of course, we're going to take a closer look at the carbon credit trading scheme and what the processes and the framework are prescribed as by the BEE. But interestingly, as of now, India already has instruments that closely resemble the carbon markets in the form of energy saving certificates, EScerts, and renewable energy certificates, REC, for regulating energy consumption and the transition to cleaner energy, which is facilitated by the Ministry of Power, MOP. We're going to spend some time to just understand each of these instruments, starting with REC. Now, to incentivize the use of RE, from a policy perspective, there can be two approaches. One way to look at it is to impose an obligation on the generator to mandatorily generate renewable energy, or you impose an obligation on the consumers to mandatorily consume renewable energy. India's RE policy adopted the latter approach, that is in the form of renewable energy purchase obligations, RPOs. Under the Electricity Act, the state governments, that is SERCs, are authorized to identify the obligated entities and prescribe the quantum of electricity that must be purchased from RE sources by these obligated entities. And the Ministry of Power also prescribes what is called the long-term growth trajectory for RPO through the tariff policy at a central level. This trajectory is uniformly prescribed for all states by the Ministry of Power, and the SERCs at the state level are instructed to notify the RPO for their respective states, which is more or less in line with the RPO trajectory that is released. Now, the state governments, drawing their authority under the Electricity Act, have identified these obligated entities, right? We can bucket them into DISCOMs, the distribution companies, captive power consumers, or open access consumers. These are the categories of obligated entities across states. So, for example, in Maharashtra, MERC has notified a uniform percentage for DISCOMs, open access consumers, and captive consumers at 29.91% for the financial year 24-25. Same goes for Gujarat. It's 20.7% for the financial year 24-25 across all the obligated entities. These percentages, of course, differ across states as seen on the slide here. Now, in 2022, the Energy Conservation Act was amended to empower the central government to specify minimum share of consumption of non-fossil sources by designated consumers as energy. It's not really very different from what we saw under the Electricity Act. It's in fact very similar to the discussion that we had on MOP and the Electricity Act regulation, right? And after this amendment, the trajectory was released in accordance with and under the Energy Conservation Act as opposed to the tariff policy. One notable deviation from the erstwhile tariff policy orders is that in the MOP order, the quantum of each type of renewable energy source is indicated, which also includes distributed renewable energy as well. Now, what this addition does is it compels the obligated entities to purchase RE from smaller RE projects having capacity of less than 10 megawatt. These figures are fungible amongst each other, right? So if you see wind renewable energy, hydro renewable energy, there are percentages that the obligated entities need to meet, but these are fungible amongst each other. And failure to meet the obligation will attract a penalty up to 10 lakh rupees for that year. We can see the trajectory prescribed by the MOP order on screen for the various kind of sources that I just mentioned. Now, why did we go through, RPO when I said we'll talk about RECs? Because fulfilling the RPO obligations can be carried out using one of the two methods. From a conventional method, you could purchase electricity from a renewable energy generator under power purchase agreements or by own generation. Or as a non-conventional method, you could purchase REC, Renewable Energy Certificate, or in fact, as allowed by the Green Open Access Rules 2022, purchase green hydrogen, green ammonia, which do not involve any actual sale or consumption of electricity. Now, when RE is generated, certain environmental attributes are also generated apart from the electricity, which is the physical attribute. These environmental attributes take the form of what we know as REC. The RECs can be traded on power exchanges or through notified power traders. So it ultimately creates a monetary benefit for eligible entities. REC was introduced under the CERC terms and conditions for recognition and issuance of Renewable Energy Certificate for Renewable Energy Generation Regulations 2010, which were superseded by the CERC REC regulations. Under these REC regulations, the certificate can be issued to renewable energy generating stations, captive generating stations, which are of course based on RE sources, distribution licensees, and open access consumers. All of these are collectively the eligible entities which can issue RECs, but it is subject to fulfillment of certain criteria which differs across these entities. Like, for example, for a renewable energy generator, the conditions for eligibility are that one, the tariff is not determined as per Section 62 or 63 of the Electricity Act. Two, the electricity is not to be sold directly or through an electricity trader on the power exchange for fulfillment of RPO compliance. The reason here is to avoid any double dipping of benefits by the renewable energy generator. And third, the third criteria is that the generating station has not availed any waiver of concessional transmission or wheeling charges. REC framework is a market-driven approach seeking to promote competition without any concessional benefits, which have the potential to skew the market, and hence the condition of not having availed any of these waivers, right? Now, as a captive generating plant based on RE sources, the criteria would be fulfilling all the criteria mentioned earlier as a REG, and that the generation component, to the extent of its own consumption, will not be eligible for sale, and the component which is beyond the self-consumption will be eligible for sale as REC. If you're an open access consumer or a DISCOM, the purchasing electricity from RE sources in excess of the RPO will be eligible for issuance of RECs. This is, of course, to the extent of the excess that is created by the purchase of electricity from RE. So how do these eligible entities that we discussed go about the process of issuing RECs? The first step in all of this is accreditation, which is granted by the state agency if the eligible entity is connected to intrastate transmission system, or RLDC, Regional Load Dispatch Center, if the eligible entity is connected to interstate transmission system. The renewable energy generating station and captive generating plant have to apply for an accreditation, and a deemed accreditation is granted to DISCOMs and open access consumers. After this, the next step is registration of the eligible entities with the National Load Dispatch Center, NLDC, which is in accordance with the procedure for implementation of REC mechanism issued by NLDC. The validity of this registration is 25 years from the date of registration. Now, lastly, the issuance of REC. After accreditation registration, there's issuance of REC, which comes as part of the next step, where eligible entities can apply for issuance of RECs to the NLDC, which controls the issuance of REC, within 6 months from the corresponding generation by the renewable energy generator or the captive generating station, and within 3 months from the end of financial year for DISCOMs and open access consumer. This is because DISCOMs and open access consumers are obviously not involved in the generation of electricity through renewable sources. So like I mentioned earlier, they're only entitled to RECs when the procurement of RE by them is in excess of their RPO obligation. And to prove this, they have to submit a certificate from the respective REC indicating that the procurement of RE from them is in excess of their RPO obligation. Like I mentioned before, RECs can be purchased, sold, and traded on the power exchanges, which are approved by CERC, like the Indian Energy Exchange, there's Power Exchange of India, or through power traders approved by the CERC. REC issued will remain valid until they are redeemed for RPO compliance. NLDC is the agency that maintains record of all the RECs that are issued, sold, purchased, and redeemed in the REC registry. Now, what does the pricing for REC look like? What determines the pricing? Price discovery of REC is actually made through power exchange or as mutually agreed between eligible entities and the electricity traders. Previously, the REC regulations of 2010, under that, the price of REC was determined by market demand and contained between the floor price and the ceiling price, the forbearance price, which is specified by REC. The price of REC would actually fluctuate between these two ranges, depending on the market conditions, and would obviously not go above or below the stipulated price fixed. This no doubt ensured a minimum return for RE generators against their investment and provided a threshold level of revenue certainty to make their RE projects more viable. But what it did not do is permit any flexibility based on the market determination beyond the floor price and the forbearance price. And therefore, under the new REC regulations, the concept of floor price and forbearance price has been removed. Following this, India Wind Power Association Northern Region Council has filed a petition challenging the constitutional validity of the REC Regulations 2022 before the Delhi High Court on the grounds that they're engaged in generation of energy on the assurance that RECs would have a minimum value, and the removal of this floor price under the REC regulations has in fact deprived them of their vested rights for obtaining the minimum price. So in December 2022, the Delhi High Court gave an order to suspend the trading of REC issued prior to the notification, the CERC notification, for a period of 6 weeks. This suspension order was further extended by subsequent orders, which extended the time period from the initial period of 6 weeks. Later, the suspension was revoked and REC trading continued. The matter has been listed for final hearing on 8th May 2024. Our team will definitely analyze the final order once it's out, and you can access our analysis on our LinkedIn page once it's out. Now, from an international renewable energy certificate market perspective, these are the internationally traded RECs that enable the transfer of environmental attributes of RE across international boundaries. They are governed by standards laid by what is called International Tracking Standard Foundation, which facilitates trade amongst consumers, electricity suppliers, electricity generators, and national government. IRECs, or international RECs, in India are issued by GCC, Green Certificate Company. GCC is appointed as the authorized issuer by the International Tracking Standard Foundation. And one conflict that we would like to address, and it's actually for avoiding double counting, is that for the duration of IRECs are claimed for a particular project, the same project cannot claim RECs as per the CERC REC regulations in India. Amoolya, over to you to just take us through the PAT scheme and EScerts, please.
Thank you, Janhavi. Now that we all understand more about the REC RPO scheme, we'll discuss the second energy saving scheme currently operating in India, which is PAT, or Perform, Achieve and Trade. Now, PAT is a mechanism designed to achieve energy efficiency standards in energy-intensive sectors such as aluminum, cement, fertilizer, iron and steel, and all that. Now, selected industries in these energy-intensive sectors are identified as DCs, or designated consumers, and they are given energy consumption standards by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, or the BEE. Now, these targets are obviously supposed to be complied with, and they are notified by the central government after taking into account the report of the BEE on the energy consumption standards and norms for each DC's plant. To put this into context, the highest number of DCs were in the second PAT cycle, standing at 621, and the cycles have averaged approximately 300 DCs, which is comparatively much lesser than the pool for REC registered entities, which is approximately 1,000 generators, not taking into account open access consumers and discoms. Essentially, what we're trying to say here is that this market is very small and the scope of this scheme is very limited. Now, the scheme essentially incentivizes the reduction of energy per unit, per energy use per unit of production in these industries, which is known as specific energy consumption, by introducing EScerts or energy saving certificates, which are tradable market instruments having energy saving attributes. One EScert is equal to 1 metric ton of oil equivalent of energy consumed, which is a unit of energy and signifies the amount of energy released by burning 1,000 kilograms of crude oil. Now, DCs who overachieve their targets, as are issued by the BEE, are issued EScerts, and those who are underachieving their targets are entitled to purchase EScerts to comply with the standards which are being set by the BEE. Now, PAT is typically implemented in cycles of 3 years, during which time the DCs are required to comply with the notified norms. The first cycle was in 2012, and since then we have seen 7 iterations, with the latest one being notified for the period from 2022 to 23 to 2024 to 25. Now, the regulatory framework for PAT, similar to REC and RPO, is under the Energy Conservation Act, the rules under the Energy Conservation Act, and the CERC regulations, specifically only for trading. The EC Act is the primary legislation, and it is the act that established the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. It also allows the central government and its authorized agencies to issue EScerts to DCs. It permits DCs to acquire EScerts, and also allows any person to buy EScerts voluntarily. All of this is under Section 14A of the Energy Conservation Act. The energy conservation rules are the energy consumption norms and standards for designated consumers, form, time within which, and manner of preparation and implementation of scheme, procedure for issue or purchase of energy saving certificates, and value per metric ton of oil equivalent of energy consumed rules 2012. Now, the PAT rules provide a methodology for calculation of SEC or specific energy consumption. They also provide methodology for calculating the consumption norms for DCs, for their monitoring, for their verification, and also the procedure for issuance of EScerts. To quickly take you through this procedure, the first step is the submission of a report by a DC specifying its compliance with the energy consumption norms and standards, which report is required to be duly verified by an energy auditor. Now, thereafter, the BEE reviews the submitted report and sends its recommendation to the central government for issuance of EScerts, specifying the exact number of EScerts that should be issued to the DC. The central government then reviews the recommendation of the BEE and issues the EScerts to the DC in online electronic form. Like RECs, which expire once used, EScerts also expire once submitted to the BEE for compliance by a DC. However, extra EScerts may be used, may be sold on the power exchange, and also may be banked by the DC for use in their next cycle. Now, banking allows a DC to carry forward excess certificates to the next PAT cycle or to the next phase if the DC feels that it's likely to not achieve its targets in the next cycle. Banked EScerts can also be sold to another DC. So now that we understand the issuance of EScerts, we can move on to trading of EScerts, which is governed by the CERC regulations, the CERC Terms and Conditions for Dealing in Energy Saving Certificates Regulations 2016. EScerts are currently dealt on the power exchanges with the CERC as the market regulator, assisted by the registry, which is the Grid Controller of India Limited, and the administrator, which is the BEE. The function of the registry is to undertake registration of eligible entities and to maintain records of EScerts. The administrator's function is to formulate a procedure for transaction of EScerts and to inform the registry on extinguishment of EScerts. The floor price for trading of EScerts is fixed at 10% of the price of 1 metric ton of oil equivalent of energy consumed, as notified by the central government from time to time. The penalty for a DC, if it fails to meet the energy consumption standards notified by the BEE under the PAT scheme, are also under Section 26 of the Energy Conservation Act and involves a monetary penalty of rupees 10 lakh and an additional penalty which is benchmarked to twice the price of 1 metric ton of oil equivalent of energy consumed as notified. To throw some numbers at you, The second iteration of the PAT cycle resulted in the highest energy savings at 14.08 metric ton of oil equivalent of energy consumed. Also, in the third iteration of the PAT cycle, the overall energy reduction targets were overachieved by 65%. And this has been a consistent trend across all three current cycles. All three cycles have resulted in overachievement of the targets by DCs, which is great, but also indicates that the DCs are being set very lenient targets. As on date, DCs continue to overperform. There is a demand-supply mismatch, and the supply of EScerts is higher than their demand. Now, I know Praveen has something to say on the two schemes that we just discussed, so I'll hand over to him.
Thanks, Amoolya, Janhavi. I think that was, that was a detailed brief on, of course, the history and, the legislative framework, as well as the regulated space in India in relation to RECs, RPOs, and EScerts. But I think just to summarize, right, I think probably Janhavi and Amoolya have already touched upon these while they kind of spoke about RECs, RPOs, and EScerts. But let me just quickly summarize. I think while it's all been done with good intentions, I think there are some challenges which are and issues that we see when it comes to implementation of RPOs and RECs in India. The first one is, of course, when it comes to RPOs, I think that the fact that it's uniform across all states, the RPO obligation is uniform. It does not take into account the RE resources and infrastructure capabilities for each state, which vary from state to state. As a consequence of this, what has happened is states which are rich in RE sources, such as we all know of them, which is Karnataka, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Himachal Pradesh, all of them have exceeded their RPO requirements, whereas non-solar rich states are unable to meet even like 5% of their RPO. In addition, because of this uniform RPO obligation, solar rich states are, we feel in some instances, deterred from developing further RE capabilities beyond their RPO obligations. The other issue that we see is a demand-supply mismatch, which my colleagues touched upon earlier. Lots of RECs are unsold, but at the same time, RPOs are also not being met. This shouldn't happen idly, but happens in India because primarily because of lack of enforcement of penalties in case of shortfall to meet RPO targets, right? Consequently, RECs remain unsold, but at the same time, new RECs keep getting issued, which means that the consequent effect of that is, of course, the price of REC keeps getting lowered due to overabundance, the principle of demand and supply, right? Of course, the other issue, which I kind of pointed out in the earlier one, is, lack of enforcement. In an ideal REC market, the premium value of green energy would be realized through a free market price, as long as the supply and demand reflect the true underlying costs. The REC market price would tend to be zero if RE-based power is cost competitive with non-RE-based power, and the system has moved towards a largely RE-based power system. However, where there is an REC price collapse, even when the system is predominantly non-RE-based, while RE-based power is getting more cost competitive, is indicative of a failure in the market takeoff. This is ironically the case in India, as the country has experienced one of the largest lowest generation costs for utility scale solar-based power, leading to a dramatic reduction in the average levelized cost of electricity of utility scale solar PV, yet its uptake has been faltered. Let's look at that. You see here the energy efficiency norms which are applicable when it comes to the PAT scheme is only applicable to energy intensive industries, which is DCs, as mentioned earlier. Therefore, the market is very concentrated to just the identified DCs. This has consequently resulted in, one of the reasons is may have resulted in oversupply of EScerts, which has led to, in the market, leading to some kind of a low demand. And again, as Amoolya touched upon this, one of the reasons for oversupply of EScerts arises from the fact that the targets which have been set are very modest, and therefore they're being easily achieved. The third issue that we noticed was, again, I won't go into great detail, but quickly touch upon it, is basically that, the trading window for EScerts is also very short. When the trading window is short, it makes it challenging to attract a large number of buyers and sellers to the exchanges. And this also results in, lower trading volumes and lesser effective price discovery mechanisms. Having said all of that, there are talks about integrating RECs, EScerts, and EScerts with carbon credits, which we believe will present an innovative approach to addressing multiple sustainability objectives simultaneously, right? The integration will simplify the management of environmental credits by consolidating them into a single market framework. It reduces administrative and burdens and costs for market participants. It provides a comprehensive solution for addressing both energy efficiency and carbon emission reduction goals. It will naturally enhance market liquidity and efficiency by increasing the volume of tradable assets and improving price discovery mechanisms, ultimately leading to a more effective allocation of resources and investments in low carbon technologies. And I also think, lastly, it will probably align incentives for emissions reduction and renewable energy generation. Of course, there are challenges in this integration, and one of the big challenges is, of course, the integration of the measurement requirements. When in case of EScerts, you have it is TOW, or it is the oil equivalent, tons of oil equivalent, as against RECs, which is megawatt hours. So therefore, there is going to be some difficulty in integrating all of this, but I think those are paths which can be crossed easily, as long as the right initiative is there. But we will deal with all of this. I think these are things that we will deal with in our next sessions to come, where we will talk in detail about carbon markets. We will talk about carbon trading, and we will also have a detailed discussion on the potential, where the single carbon market, which could potentially subsume both EScerts and RECs. I think that's largely what we wanted to cover today. Thank you, everyone, for listening in on this. I'm just going to quickly check if there are any particular questions which have come in. Please feel free to add in questions if you'd like to. I think we have some questions. I think the first one was on difference between CERs and VERs. Amoolya, you want to just quickly touch upon that?
Sure. So as we discussed, carbon credits which result from emission reduction projects, specifically under the Clean Development Mechanism, under the Kyoto Protocol, are referred to as certified emission reductions, or CERs. Now, along with this market, there is also a voluntary carbon market under the CDM. And reduction units on account of that voluntary carbon market are referred to as VERs. Now, this is completely separate from the compliance market, which is, like I said, under the Kyoto Protocol and now under the Paris Agreement. And this voluntary carbon market enables companies and individuals to take responsibilities for their emissions. Now, there are various international standards, for example, Gold Standard and Verra, for certifying these carbon offset projects and providing the amount of carbon emissions avoided, reduced, or removed. These projects have to undergo rigorous monitoring and verification to ensure that claimed emissions reductions and sustainable development are actually measured and reported. And such carbon credits resulting from these emission reduction projects have attained voluntary third-party approval rather than the CDM board approval or the supervisory body under the Paris Agreement or any government pursuant to their domestic compliance mechanism. So this is what VERs are. They are under the voluntary market, and CERs are under the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol.
Okay, I'm just seeing if we have any other questions. I think there's another one, which is, can IREX be used for RPO compliance in India? I think, Janhavi, you were covering this. You want to kind of touch upon this? Or?
Sure, yes. So the RPO compliance and RPO obligation really falls within the compliance framework under the Indian regulatory system. So RPO, like I said, can be fulfilled by the conventional method, which is you purchase renewable energy through a PPO or you set up your own generation system, or through other methods like, renewable energy certificate issued by the issuer in the National Dispatch Load Center in India, or purchase green hydrogen, green ammonia as given under the latest green open access rules, right? IREX is actually, completely covered under the voluntary market, and that can't be merged with fulfilling or offsetting your RPO obligation that is required as per law in India. So no, the IREX can't be used for RPO compliance in India.
Okay, I think we have a couple of more questions. Okay, we have one which is, will virtual power purchase agreements boost the use of IREX? Yes, we'll touch upon this in more detail as we go into the next sessions. But just to quickly answer your question, yes, adoption of VPPA structures in India can boost the use of energy attribute certificates like IREX. VPPA effectively, or a virtual power purchase agreement, is basically a financial transaction wherein where the green attributes of the renewable energy are split from the electricity to create green renewable energy credits and brown power. And the generator sells the brown power on the power exchange, and the associated renewable green energy credits can be sold to a buyer under the VPPA. I think that we've, if I'm not mistaken, I think the first of the few that happened in India is, I think, Cleantech Solar announced some commercial operation of a first VPPA where they had kind of sold it on the project was registered on the International Renewable Energy Certificates mechanism, and the IREX generated are being purchased by one of the leading FMCG companies under a VPPA. So yes, it's possible. But we will get into more details probably in the next sessions on this. I think we had one other question which we'll quickly touch upon before we wind up on the webinar. As a RE generator, can I generate REC if it is being supplied to DISCOMs, that is utility projects? Amoolya, Janhavi, you want to just...
Sure. So Praveen, the answer to that question, short answer to that question, no. Long answer to that question is that RECs, like Janhavi explained, are generated by a renewable energy generating station only in very, very specific circumstances. If your tariff is being determined on a cost plus basis by a SERC under Section 62, you're out. If it is being discovered under a competitive bidding process under Section 63, also you're out of the REC mechanism. If the power which is being generated is being sold or even traded on a power exchange in order to meet an RPO compliance of an obligated entity, then also you're out. And the fourth is that if you're taking any concessional waivers for transmission charges or for wheeling charges, also you can't issue RECs. Now, specific to this situation, if you are selling power to a DISCOM, it is most likely under a competitive bid process. That is true for all SECI bids, where SECI is acting as an intermediary procurer. It is also likely true for all state DISCOMs, which will, for economic reasons, go for Section 63 tariffs, which is competitively bid tariffs. So in that situation, RECs are not being generated by the project, and therefore you cannot take advantage of the REC mechanism.
Perfect. I hope that answers the question, Ishani. Thanks for your question. I think that's about it. We don't have anything else, but feel free to write to us. Our email IDs and our contact details are here. Thank you very much for joining us. And we are hoping that you will join us for the next two sessions, which I think will probably be not so theoretical around, the legislative framework, but all of the other things which are happening across the world on carbon markets and how we kind of integrate carbon markets into India as well. We will come out with those dates very soon. We are hoping to do this over the course of the next 2 months, and look forward to seeing all of you all again. Thank you. Thank you very much.